Emotional and Sensory Profiling by Children and Teenagers. A case study of the check all that apply method on biscuits by Theon, Livia, Eugene, and Joanne. In the food industry, understanding the consumer's motives for product choice is important for development and marketing. Sensory and emotional profiling methods are useful in this regard to examine consumer preference and the acceptability of food products. While there is an increasing amount of consumer sensory information, these types of analyses are generally executed by trained or untrained adult panelists. As a result, there is a distinct lack of information regarding perception of food by children and teenagers, who make up a large proportion of the consumers. With this in mind, this paper aims to examine the emotional and sensory profiling by children and teenagers on speculoos, a traditional Flemish biscuit, through the use of the CATA method. The Check All That Apply method, CATA, involves participants selecting any number of relevant descriptors from a given set that apply to the question. If it's not relevant, it can be ignored. The lack of need for a standard intensity scaling or traditional descriptive analysis method provides a simplistic method of data analysis that can be used by children and teenagers. Now let's take a look at the method of this study in 5 sections. Participants. Overall, 122 children and teenagers aged 10 to 14 with informed consent across 4 elementary schools in Flanders participated in this study. Any participant with food allergies were excluded from the experiment. Samples. The food of question in the study was a traditional Flemish short crust biscuit called speculoos. This biscuit was chosen for its familiarity, so the effect of brand on emotional profiling could also be assessed. 4 different brands of speculoos were chosen to mimic market segmentation: a multinational brand, a private label, a local producer, and speculoos from a local bakery. All samples were presented in a rectangular shape with no brand imprints to prevent bias. Terminology. The emotional and sensory terminology given to the participants were consolidated by another group of children and teenagers with the researchers prior to the main study. Firstly, the youth evaluated 59 emotional and sensory terms from a previous study with the opportunity to add their own. Next, the researchers narrowed down to a set of terms that were the most common and recognizable to children and teenagers. Finally, 29 emotional and sensory terms were selected, with an equal number of positive and negative emotional terms to avoid valence bias. Experiment design. The experiment itself was conducted over 2 sessions, where 3 different conditions were examined: the blind, the logo, and the informed conditions. In the blind condition, participants tasted unbranded speculoos to study the impact of sensory characteristics alone on the overall liking and emotional profiling of the product. In the logo condition, only the brand of the biscuits were presented, and participants revealed their expectation for overall liking without tasting. Finally, in the informed condition, both the brand and corresponding biscuits were presented, and the participants evaluated both the sensory and emotional experience of each sample. The first session tested only the blind condition, which was done in a 3-step procedure. Firstly, the participants took 1 bite and expressed their overall liking of the biscuits using a 9-point hedonic scale, followed by a CATA assessment of the sensory profile of each sample, and lastly, they took another bite and expressed their emotional experience through another CATA assessment. The participants were instructed to rinse their mouths with water after each sample. The second session took place 6 to 10 weeks after the first, where both the logo and informed conditions were assessed. After indicating their most recent consumption of the varying biscuit brands, the participants were shown 9 different packages of the products to assess their brand knowledge. Then participants assessed their overall liking and emotional conceptualization of the brands without tasting. That was all the logo condition assessment. A 15-minute break took place, and then was followed by the informed condition assessment, whereby the participants were provided branded samples and the same emotional and sensory profiling that was done in the blind condition. Hashtag data analysis. Various statistical methods were utilized to analyze the results of the experiments, including the mixed ANOVA, which compared the liking scores of samples, Cochrane's Q test, which examined differences in frequencies of term selections, McNemar test for the pairwise comparison between products for each term during a specific condition, and correspondent analysis for the term selection in regards to each condition. Results and discussions. Familiarity of brands. Hashtag logo identification. 94% identified the multinational brand logo, which was also consumed the most with the shortest interval. 41% had the product less than a week ago. 54% identified the local producer logo. However, 78% had never consumed it before. 47.5% identified the private label logo. However, only 40% had tried the product before. 25% identified the local bakery logo, but 72% had never tried it before. So basically, only the multinational label was well known and familiar to the children. Hashtag mean liking scores. The multinational label had the highest scores overall, followed by the private label. Both the local producer and bakery had lower scores in the informed condition compared to the blind and logo condition. Brand information was considered to have a significant impact only in the multinational and local bakery brands. Hashtag CATA. The graph here displays the results of the CATA test involving the measure of the emotional perception by children and teenagers during the experiment, displaying results of the multinational brand to the local bakery from left to right across each emotional term. It can be seen that the emotional profiles of the samples were significantly different between each condition, and this became the basis for the study statement that the CATA approach can be applied to detect differences in emotional characterization of food products with children and teenagers, which was in line with the findings of other studies involving the CATA test on children. The most frequently consumed and well-known products were largely associated with positive emotional terms and less associated with negative emotional terms, mainly observed in the multinational and private labels by the difference between the red and purple circles. Products that the children were not familiar with obtained a range of ratings that were not as easily interpretable. Brand familiarity could therefore play a role in emotional profiling, which was recognized by the study to require further research. However, while brand may have played an effect, the study concluded that the emotional conceptualizations are mainly sensory-driven. This was seen on observation of the local producer, where the number of participants checking the same positive emotions was substantially lower in the logo condition but similar in the blind and informed conditions, as observed by the red circles. This next graph shows the results of the CATA test involving the measure of the sensory aspect of the experiment. Obtaining of the data led to the conclusion that the CATA approach can be successfully applied for obtaining discriminatory sensory profiles when using an age-appropriate protocol. More discriminating sensory profiles were obtained in the informed condition, so the right half of each descriptor, which suggested that the information influenced the discriminatory capability of the CATA. In terms of the overall experiment, the need for comparison of results to traditional sensory evaluation was recognized as the CATA method may not mimic real-life situations. Hashtag bias. Hedonic liking scales were used to reduce potential bias caused by unfamiliarity of emotional and sensory terms. Respondent bias was recognized in Session 2, even though significant differences were obtained, where children may have tried to score the informed condition samples similar to the logo condition as they were done in the same session. Potential bias was also recognized in the setting of the experiment, The suggested modification was to perform the experiment in a different setting, like a simulated environment. Further research of modifications was stated to be required to understand the full extent of these biases. Conclusion. #aim. The aim was to investigate the emotional and sensory profiling of a traditional biscuit product, speculoos, among children and teenagers. This is the first study targeting children and teenagers using the check all that apply method to combine sensory and emotional profiling. #showcase. The study showed that the brand of the food product, which in this case was speculoos, influences both the overall liking and sensory perception of teenagers and children. #application. They can potentially use the check all that apply method to collect children and teenagers' emotional and sensory views on a food product in future studies. Producers can use the information on the children's attitudes towards their biscuit and brand to help them come up with promotional ideas and how they can introduce their food products to a younger market. #method. The check all that apply method was used, examined in 3 conditions: the blind, where the biscuit was sampled without knowledge of the brand; the logo, where the brand was presented without the biscuit; and the informed, where both biscuit and brand were revealed. #YCATA. The check all that apply method gives us a complete overview on children and teenagers' perception of a product. It includes sensory terms, so we can easily determine why the children liked or disliked the food product. And the emotional concept of the method lets us analyze deeper than the usual liking measurements and helps us to better understand children's experience of consuming a product. Overall, both the sensory and emotional aspects of this method provides information to help with product development and marketing purposes. Thank you for watching, and we hope you enjoyed it.